As I mentioned during the introductions, my name is Nate Walker. I work for AFT Michigan. I'm the policy analyst and K-12 organizer. Fell into that position as a 8th grade teacher for the Detroit Public Schools for 5 years, and so taken me into the policy path because I made a decision in 2009 that I no longer wanted to work as a 7th grade teacher so far as what I was being asked to do put me in a position where it was difficult to advocate for my students and their education. What I was being asked to do was to make decisions based on what I thought would prepare my class to best succeed on high-stakes testing. Right? And when I say prepare my class to best succeed on high-stakes testing, that didn't necessarily mean coming up with sort of the pedagogical skills to help them perform well. It meant figuring out ways to counsel kids out of my classroom. It meant figuring out ways to, when we decided who was in each class at the beginning of the school year, figuring out the number that would most likely lead to the higher test score for my room in particular, because the charter school that I was working at decided that they were going to tie our pay to performance on those high-stakes tests. And this was something that was really near and dear to my heart because my room sort of became a collecting ground of difficult students who were challenging other teachers, and I was able to build relationships with some of these students, and so I enjoyed the challenge of building relationships with them, and my door was always open to transfer students into. And I felt like, wow, there's this incentive now for me not to build relationships with the most difficult students because I would likely not be working there in a year or two because of the performance measures. And so we thought this was an issue we could collectively bargain, and so we decided to form a union at that charter school. And that's a whole different topic for a different talk, which I'd love to, if folks have questions about, address later. But I tell that story at the beginning of a story about legislation and where our state's headed, because high-stakes testing is sort of the linchpin that is holding together high-stakes decisions. And there was always standardized testing, but kids were taking Iowa tests for years and years and years, right? They were used as assessment measures. But really, in 2002, you start to see something that's a little bit different, and that is the No Child Left Behind Act that basically said the federal government, right, is going to mandate that states show whether or not schools are performing. So it's the first real time they sort of meet high-stakes testing, right? But there was no real meat to it because the federal government doesn't fund schools. What they do is they fund Title I for the neediest schools, and so the only stick to not doing well on the high-stakes tests were places like Detroit, where if you didn't meet AYP or adequate yearly progress, your school could be reconstituted or these sorts of things, right? The Obama administration sort of doubled down on the idea that high-stakes testing is a good way to make high-stakes decisions. And they did that through what's called the Race to the Top grant. How many of you have heard of that, Race to the Top? Right? So what Race to the Top was it was making available funding for different states to compete to then get that funding. And the way you competed was you made your state a desirable climate for education reform. And so this idea of competing, I'm going to get back to because I think that's what's ultimately at the heart of the decisions around public education and how it's being funded and that sort of stuff. But I want to pause the competition piece for a moment and sort of go back to the Race to the Top piece. So there was this rubric about what makes a state a desirable place to receive Race to the Top money. Well, one is that if there was no cap on charter schools, you would be much more likely to receive Race to the Top funding. Another would be is if you had a high Teach for America density, right? You'd be more likely to receive Race to the Top funding. Another was that if you identified your persistently lowest achieving schools as a state, and you implemented reform plans to turn those schools around, so school turnaround you would be desirable for Race to the Top, right? So in 2000, and part of this was under our previous governor, but in 2009, 2010, in an effort to look attractive for the Race to the Top grant, Michigan passed a couple of laws. One of those laws, and it's become the birthing bill for moving EAA. How many have heard of EAA education? Mm-hmm. It's become the birthing bill for moving that further along. But one of these laws said that Michigan would publish a list of the bottom 5 performing schools in the state, and if you were on that list, you would by law have to implement one of 4 reform plans. One of those plans is to close your school. So you could say, hey, this is how we're going to improve our school. We're going to close it. One of those plans was to turn your school into a charter school. The other was to turn your school around. So turning your school around meant removing at least half of the staff that was there, even if they were protected by a collective bargaining contract, and removing the school leader. Unless that school leader had only been there for 1 year. In that case, they would let that school leader have a trial year, I suppose. And then the other one was this idea of transformation. And transformation was, how are you going to contract with programs or other things to improve your test score? And those programs consisted from ideas like more seat time in math and reading and less arts and music. Your school would have to show how you would hit these needy kids with those programs. And so that was one of the bills. Another bill had to do with teachers and teacher evaluation, and that bill said that as part of teachers' evaluation, a significant factor in determining whether or not a teacher was effective had to be based on standardized test score, or the test that the state gave. And the real kicker to that bill was if a teacher was evaluated as ineffective through the standardized testing measurement, parents would be notified at the beginning of that school year that this teacher was evaluated as ineffective. And that was somehow supposed to help the teacher along become more, by letting everyone know that this teacher's an ineffective teacher. And so that was 2010. Since 2010, you've seen the scope of those bills broaden, right? So they've added to them. They've taken evaluation off of the bargaining table for public employees, right? So you can't bargain it anymore. And now there's a bill that's being presented in House Committee next week that says significant factor. That doesn't go far enough. Standardized testing has to be the primary factor in determining whether or not a teacher comes back to the school, but also teachers' compensation. So it basically allows, and I urge you, call your legislators, because this bill is going to go to committee next week. It basically says that experience cannot be a factor in determining teacher pay, and the primary factor has to be compensation. And so the EAA bill, has also moved further along. So right now, the Education Achievement Authority, the statewide district, is established through an. Yeah.
Can I just interject? Because something you said, again, for whoever came in late, like I teach kindergarten and I'm a parent, my kids went to Ann Arbor Open School. And what you're saying about that standardized testing and how it correlates with educators and our pay and our livelihood. Teaching kindergarten, my principal gave us some autonomy and let us skip the first test, which happens the 20th day of school for 5-year-olds. So we took the second round of testing, and that was February, and we just took the second test again. And it's just interesting. Again, they're 5. I bring them all in. I tell them, we're going to play math games on the computer. Like, I'm not saying, this is the NWEA, and this is very important, and if you don't do well, then I don't get paid. And, I tell them, we're going to the computer lab, we're going to play some math games, and when you're done, we're going to go in the other room and color, And, I had children who I've watched all year who I know have really solid math concepts who are like this, click, click, click. They're kind of like, I'm going to go, I want to be done. Like, I don't want to do this. Click, click, click. I look at the number. I know what the mean score has to be for my kids to look like they have performed this year and that I have done my job as an educator to give them all the skills they need to move on to the next level. Like, 2 of my higher math kids were like in the lowest scores. They were done. They take their headphones off. They go off into the other room. And I have other kids sitting there. One's crying. I can't read it. I'm like, of course you can't, because you're 5. I'm like, that's fine. Just click and keep going. And I have a struggle with what I agree with what you're saying. I just want other people who might not know the reality of what it's like in the school and in the classroom to know that can't be the only measure of a student's growth and achievement. I mean, I see these kids, they come in, some can't zip their pants, you know, some come out with their pants down after they go potty. I can't, help me, Mrs. Stewart. I'm like, yeah. You know, learning their math and everything. We do all that in kindergarten, but that one test can't be the only thing that says a school is achieving, that a school is doing well, and that the teacher is doing her job in educating the student. So I just want to share that because it's very real.
Because I teach 8th grade,
real.
and we are in the midst of the second, because we only started piloting it in February. So we're in the second round of NWA testing with 8th graders. This is what 8th graders do. Click. I can't click it too quickly because then it'll shut me out.
Right.
What are you doing? What's on your screen? Click. Are we done yet? They don't take it seriously.
And nor should they have to.
I look at these kids, and some of them are just so unmotivated, and I think, you're going to determine my compensation, you're going to determine whether my school is doing well. I teach in a gifted program. 2 of my 5 classes are gifted kids, and I refused. I tested them the first time, they went off the charts, and I went to my principal and I said, what is this test going to tell me?
And I think that's I think the sentiments that were just shared sort of get to the underlying piece when you tie decisions about schools, about teachers, about students, you place incentives on how people behave that have nothing to do with what's in the best interest for the young people they're working with. And I think so. Then the question is, and I'll take only like sort of 3 or 4 more minutes just to peel this back. So like, why, right? Is it just that? Is it that people firmly believe that by giving a 5-year-old a standardized assessment so that 5-year-old can show 1 year's worth of growth, is that what's in the best interest for young people? Or is there something else happening? And so what's the something else happening? Well, the something else happening is this you know, what's often gets talked about, it's called a neoliberal model of education. Basically, it operates under this assumption that public education, right, and education as a public good is not serving our students well because, you know, they'll use terms like monopoly, right? They have a monopoly over how education happens. And so there's no incentive, there's no reason for them to improve because they don't have to, because there's no competition with other schools. And so public education will never get better. I mean, this is the theory behind it. Will never get better if you throw additional resources at it, if you try to improve it from the inside, because the only way, you know, Taylor schools will improve is if they're competing with Trillium Academy down the street. And this idea that competition between the schools, right, will drive everyone there to do better, and they'll do better for their students. And so when we talk about standardized testing being the linchpin, is well, if you're relying on competition in a market to decide, you know, deliver the best education, you need a way to sort of make comparisons of that market, right? And so the standardized test score, this idea of growth, is this construct to be able to say, oh yeah, you know, Ann Arbor Open is in the 85th percentile, and, you know, King in Detroit is in the 2nd percentile, and so parents should not go to King, they should go to Ann Arbor Open, because this test score is how we're going to make those evaluations, and that's our way of regulating the consumer market. And so when we talk about what's really at stake here with this legislation, it's this agenda of neoliberal free market peace to education to set up a system of competition that absolves the public good from having the responsibility of investing in their young people. Because people are always going to make the argument, well, private sector can do more with less. And so I'm going to stop there just because I see other folks are anxious to sort of hop in.
I'm going to let Stephanie speak, and then I think we'll break up into
well, it's interesting you talk about competition. Not only are we competing, but we're competing with less. Because for every charter, public school academy, whatever they want to call themselves that opens, that is less resources for the public schools. So when I started teaching, this is my post-stay-at-home mom career, I went into it because I thought it would be fun and I thought I'd be good at it. And it's hard to say this, I know I'm going to joke about it. It's not fun anymore. Like, my job is horrible. I stood in front of a room of 8th graders today and said, I have to give you 3 bubble tests, or 2 bubble tests and a computer adaptive test in a span of 6 days. And they look at me and they're like, why are you doing this? It's not me. And so I'm getting involved. Sorry about this. I got involved because to me it's, we talk about the reasons behind it. I think there's a profit motive, that education was a multi-billion-dollar business, and how could the businesses get their hands on that when we had the monopoly? And they have vast resources behind them. It's the in thing to do with billionaires to, you know, it's their little hobby. Bill Gates and the Broad Foundation, we're going to dabble and we're going to, you know, put our mark on public education, and it's a combination of greed and hubris. Like, we know what's best. Bill Gates knows what's best for public education, darn it, because he started Microsoft. So it's a profit motive, and I think a lot of it is misogyny. You know, who are teachers? We're 85 to 90% women. So I think behind a lot of this is, they're just women, they're teachers, it doesn't matter. And so when you combine that, and I think there's jealousy. I mean, teachers, for the most part, we think we have, at least before, I would say, going back to this whole race to the top, we thought we had the greatest job in the world. You know, you talk to teachers, we wake up in the morning, we go into work, and I think there are a lot of people who have their McJobs or do whatever, and they're in their careers because that's what they were expected to do, and they look at this group of people that are just so happy to go into work every day, and then all of a sudden it became like, well, let's really look at them, you know, and it's kind of a ganging up.
It shouldn't be so good, right? It shouldn't be so good.
You know, look at them with their cushy pensions of about $32,000 a year living high on the hog, and look at them with their 3 months off in the summer. Apparently nobody taught them math. That July and August are 2 months. So
or that your pay is spread out through the whole year.
Right.
Like your $42,000 is
right, and
we
we don't work 8 to 3 and have an hour for lunch either. So part of the reason, so you know, to me it's a whole bunch of forces coming together. So what Heather and I are doing is trying to form an advocacy group, and we came up with a bit of a platform that we would like to see. The first thing is there's this huge myth that's being propagated that public schools are failing because of a small percent that actually are failing. And when you look at schools in Ann Arbor, and when you look at, you know, overall schools in like Bloomfield Hills and Forest Hills out near Grand Rapids, and these wealthy upper middle class suburbs, public education is not failing anybody. And so really what it comes down to is socioeconomic status and poverty being a big factor in that, right? I mean, if a kid comes to school hungry and worried about, you know, where my next meal's coming from, and, you know, in the same clothes they've been wearing for the past 6 months because they can't afford to, it just creates a whole, just a whole set of problems.
It adds layers to
Right.
what we're expecting as educators when we come into the classroom.
But when we say anything about it, we are looked at, you're making an excuse. You're making an excuse because then you have this whole cohort of the I call them corporatist educators like Michelle Rhee, who stand up there and talk about it's all for the kids, it's all for the kids, and not realizing that when you demoralize teachers to the point where they don't want to do their jobs anymore, that it doesn't benefit anybody's kids. So, you know, it's this whole myth that we're failing, that these people have the answer. The answer is Teach for America, which my daughter is starting as a Teach for America fellow in the month. And if anybody thinks that she's going to be the savior of public education, they've got another thing coming to them. So it's this, and the whole, back to the financial piece, is if you get these young teachers that don't stick around for a long time, then you have no legacy costs.
Well, there's a huge problem.
Right?
Like
They don't,
the
you don't have to-
longevity of your investment now.
Right.
Public school teachers, like, career time is being shortened.
The modal,
Huge.
if you look, so ways of what we call average, there's mean, median, mode. The modal average teacher in the United States is a first-year teacher. That means, you know, that's what comes up. The modal is
most
1 year
One
of
freaking
experience.
year.
So, so we came up with this platform that we call, actually it's a friend of ours who's the superintendent of Bloomfield Hills, who's a great guy and a great advocate for public education. So his platform, it's a platform of respect, and the first R stands for reject the ideas that all schools are failing. They are not. So we kind of, again, this myth that we need to do something, it's urgent, the United States, our kids are, oh my gosh, we're failing. And then the E is for empower and involve our current public education system. You know, for all this talk of failing, people still flock to our country to, you know, raise their kids and to go to college. So, you know, seeing public education as essential for a strong democracy. Okay, like police, fire protection, and public libraries, education is a public good and should be managed and appropriately regulated for the common welfare of citizens. It should not be corporate charter schools. I don't know how many of you are aware that 80% of the charter schools in Michigan are for-profit corporate schools, the highest in the country. Michigan has 25% of all the for-profit charters in the whole country. So then, the respect. RES is for student performance should not be measured with standardized tests. How ironic that we all want our students to have personalized education, but then want to put them all into little, you know, boxes together. Unfortunately for those who stress accountability as the primary driver of change, such classroom-based assessments cannot be used to compare, rank, sort, and select. That's our platform with that. For P, professionals are key to improving public education. A lot of times, our voices aren't heard. Our voices certainly aren't heard in Lansing. Part of that problem is that the leadership of the MEA kind of poisoned the water for us. And a lot of times the leadership of the MEA, which I would also criticize, gets conflated with those of us who actually belong to the union and are out there working every day. So I've actually gone to Lansing 2 summers ago. There were 2 Republican representatives who started an education reform work group, and I said, well, the hell you're going to do this without any teachers in the room. So I went and started kind of trying to build relationships with people who were sitting there and doing teacher bashing. So the idea is that, and I would talk to them and be like, oh, well, teachers don't offer us our opinion. Like, teachers don't feel like you're going to listen. We don't feel like we have a voice. So professionals, listen to us, listen to what we're doing. Stop micromanaging us. Bill Gates wants cameras in every classroom in America. He thinks that would be great. You could have classrooms, you could see what's going on in every classroom at every minute, and then we could, you know, take standardized test scores and we could see, well, let's look at the kids who did really well, and then let's look at the videotape and let's show the videotape of that teacher to other teachers, without thinking that, gosh, maybe those kids all come from 2-family homes with well-educated parents in one classroom, and it's not anything the teacher's doing, it's genetics and socioeconomic status. The second E in respect is for evaluation of teachers, should be about building capacity. Right now, in this state, pretty much every teacher is on tenterhooks about this being evaluated on students' test scores. It's punitive, okay? It's not about, gosh, let's take a teacher who might be underperforming and get them some assistance and see what's going on. It's about, you didn't hit your value-added model, you're out of there. So it should be about, gosh, here's, you know, how we're going to make you a better teacher, and your goal would be to build capacity and make your staff good, as opposed to, you know, making everybody competing with each other, really, for you to be highly effective. If you're not highly effective, how can I be highly effective? And so, you know. The C is for comprehensive education, should be the norm for every student. You know, Nate talked about doing away with arts and physical education. And putting more seat time in math and science. As a math teacher, that horrifies me, you know. So all students deserve to have the opportunity to experience a rich, well-rounded educational experience, going beyond core academics to include music, the arts, physical education, world languages, electives, and co-curricular activities. And the T, time and resources are essential to a world-class system of public education. In the rush for results and in reformers' demands that educators do more with less, it's important to remember that there are no quick fixes. So